I flew to San Francisco to meet the team that built an AI you can hand your project to and walk away.
One of the craziest parts about missions is that they leave your code base in a very meaningfully better state than when you started.
We're not talking about any type of project. We're talking about something that would have cost you $100,000 or more several years ago, fully built out in enormous amounts of detail.
If you actually say, we want an AI system to fully modernize this entire code base, the end result is just more trustworthy.
This team is Refactoring AI, and they're a tiny team based out of San Francisco.
The code, I feel like, does not resemble anything like what it looked like even 4 weeks ago.
Wow. And like I was saying, you can just describe what you want, and it breaks it down into small tasks where it just writes the code, checks its own work, and just keeps going. In fact, one of their runs actually went for 16 days.
Take a task, turn it into a bunch of features, and then let agents work on those features and clear the context.
I really wanted to get beyond the hype, beyond all the Twitter nonsense, and get right to the real engineering. So this is why we're here.
I've been using it to perform huge refactors of our code base, right?
So what they showed me is the exact type of conversation that's happening right now in San Francisco that most people never get to sit on.
The initial planning phase should basically think through everything. That's how we can maintain coherence across this really long horizon.
So let me show you what they actually showed me.
That Anthropic blog post is great because it sort of was an initial attempt at task decomposition, which is, I think, one of the things that missions does well. And basically it was like, take a task, turn it into a bunch of features, and then let agents work on those features and clear the context, which actually sort of works and basically is what Ralph Wiggums and a bunch of other folks techniques sort of base their strategies on. It's like clear context lets you work more effectively. And if you have a big problem, if you break it into a bunch of small problems, it works better. But there are so many issues that happen when you try to actually take that approach and build on top of it.
The worker would take a feature, implement it, and basically be instructed to, okay, now please, test the user surface. But the issue is that basically there was no kind of structured, a deterministic kind of validation. So that's I guess one of the more novel and important aspects of missions is that initial planning phase, we define a lot of things, right? It's quite an extensive phase, but one of the things we create is a validation contract. So a validation contract is basically generated from let's say you have a spec for what you want to build. We convert that into assertions. So such that the sum of these assertions basically can define the shape of what you want to build. And basically if you've actually built what you desire, all of these assertions should pass. There's a concept of milestones, basically like a group of features. Basically, per milestone, we basically say, okay, after this milestone, which of these assertions should now pass? And then we basically spawn agents to verify those assertions. Something pretty significant about kind of what these assertions are is they tend to test the user. They test from the user's point of view. So the surface closest to what the user is using. Because I guess the philosophy behind that is that how do people actually find bugs in software, right?
Right.
Well, they use it, and then when they do some action, and then what results is not what they expect, then that's a bug.
I see.
Right. So I think basically by testing the user surface, you can cover what's really important, and also it just kind of cover all the actual paths within the code as well in a very efficient way.
What is a mission and kind of what is it that you guys have architected here? Because I understand that you kind of started to hack around at this a couple of months ago, right? As a kind of a solo project.
I remember the first real success was maybe month, 3 weeks, 4 weeks in, where I was able to run a mission that was able to build a very compelling clone of Slack that is full real time, everything pretty the core functionality, all working. But that mission was broken down a lot. It took a really, really long time. And at the time, I believe I used GPT 5.2 as the orchestrator as well as the validator, and Opus 4.5 as the implementation worker. I think prior to that, I tried using Opus a lot, Opus orchestration, Opus validation, but at the time it was 4.5. There's no 4.6. And it was clearly just not fit. It didn't really work. the validation, like it wasn't like very thorough. I feel like Opus doesn't, especially 4.5, doesn't care as much about correctness.
Wow.
So it might like take more shortcuts. So it wouldn't like validate properly. And even if it did, right, and then you have like validation like issues like coming back to the orchestrator, but then Opus 4.5 orchestrator would maybe just skip them or ignore them. And it was really when I switched to like 5.2 that I started seeing success. And I think that was the moment where like it was, you know, I felt that like this is really possible.
Basically what I'm doing, it's got like 76 tasks, and this is massive. I actually have, I think it says cached 20 million tokens, output 85K. And I'm basically shipping an app, and it's for the Canoe Club over in Hawaii. So they need a way to like get everyone on board, who's available, who's actually can do paddling. And so like this, you know, it's like a shoot for a sport. It's got like authentication. It's got, you know, you can sign up, you can create your own groups. It's got the whole full-fledged app. Everything, you know, was just a conversation, you know, trying to figure out what this looks like. And I said, you know, I want to hook it up to Convex. I want to hook it up to Clerk. It's running its tests and so forth. So this is like the mission control for me. As of now, we have like the active feature that's currently going here. So we hit F for features. This will show us all the features that it's been working on and how it's like organized everything. So there's like 76 of them. And you can see all the stuff that's completed and how it's organized them here, right? You guys are shipping like all kinds of things, right? Like this thing is not also meant for 0 to 1, but it's also meant to go in your code base. Can you guys talk a little bit more about that? Because I think that a lot of people are really curious. It's like, oh, cool. Like, yeah, I can make a, you know, an app from scratch, like, but I'm not that. I work at a company and we have an existing code base. Would love to hear more about your experience with that and kind of the thinking through of what's actually happening underneath the hood.
So when we think about implementing a feature, we think about it both from a validation perspective of like how would an agent actually go about and validate this later on, but also how do we make sure that like, you have the proper lint rules and proper like testing, unit testing that is in place, maybe even end-to-end testing, such that as you're working on a mission, right, a project with like potentially like unbounded scope, you can continue to have like those same software development like guarantees in place. If this feature causes a bug somewhere else in the product that you're creating, you end up getting, you know, feedback via that end-to-end test, that unit test that maybe fails. In addition to, you know, that actual validation that we're performing from that like user testing perspective. And I think that really kind of goes to drive these outcomes that can be, you know, 0 to 1 applications. So we could tell a mission, you know, go ahead and create a Slack clone, which was one of our like original ideas as we were building this out. And then nowadays I've been using it to like perform huge refactors of our code base, right? Situations where we have end-to-end tests, we have unit tests, and then now we're trying to see, okay, can we couple both the user testing and these like sort of like deterministic tests that we have in place to reach outcomes that are like, well, I would have thought about 3 or 4 months ago were previously like unattainable.
One of the things that the workers do is whenever possible, they'll write like tests first and then implement. If the worker like implements first and then writes tests, right? Its tests that it writes will be influenced, like biased by the implementation, which will make them less effective at actually catching like bugs. So we apply that at the per worker level. That's one of kind of the best practices, looks at that we kind of enforce. But I think, you know, the validation that I talked about earlier, right? Where we kind of during the planning phase will like come up with like a list of criteria or assertions that need to pass. And we do that before we even like make the feature breakdown. We certainly do that before any implementation happens. And you kind of see it as like a higher order kind of application of test-driven development, where again, you're like defining these criteria based on purely on like the spec that the user, what the user expects, rather than being influenced by what actually exists.
I see. How different is this from like, I hear other people saying, well, I don't write plans anymore. And so maybe explain a little bit more about what a plan and spec is in vocabulary terms, and then how you guys view this type of engineering. Because I feel like you guys are totally on a different like level. And I don't think people realize the like what's really happening underneath the hood to make this system be really intelligent, and also how you're kind of thinking about the context windows and how everything is playing here. Is it just like one session? Are you just swapping the model out, or are you actually doing, you know, what's the concept of subagents? Because people, I mean, I guess personally speaking, I have, try to like launch these parallel agents doing all this crazy stuff. And I don't know, raise your hand if you've ever had the same thing too with you out there where you're just like, yeah, I have like 50, Cloud Code windows open. I have like a Codex window over here and then I have them arguing and then I have, all these crazy things going on. What's kind of like the sauce there and what's the thinking for, even specs? Like how does that go into specs and what you guys are actually doing?
In the mission lifecycle.
In missions in particular, I think like a big point that's important is that the initial planning phase should basically think through everything. That's how we can maintain coherence across this really long horizon, is that initially like the models, like especially the newest generation models they're at the point where they're actually able to like plan out really large projects. Like even if you have a really huge spec, it's still like very compressed down compared to like the code that's required to implement it. They're also very good at delegation. So like another like important principle behind missions, I think, is like separation of concerns. Like your orchestrator, for example, like for any investigation, it always delegates that to a subagent. And it doesn't implement anything, right? After the features are defined and it starts running, if something's surfaced, like there's some kind of blocker or some issue that requires like re-steering, redirection, it just purely does like, it redirects by editing like this features file that basically determines what workers will do. The reason that missions can run so long and maintain coherence is because of how much compute really goes into the initial planning phase.
I always think that it's helpful to understand why did we build such a system. And when you think about what customers are able to do, we see a broad diversity of customers. Most of them are in the Fortune 500, but we also, there's startups, scale-ups, solo developers, and generally, people who are quite advanced with using AI have figured out these like really elaborate ways to spec out and scale out the usage of agents. But I think that when you think about a problem that a like systemically important bank has, we have this huge legacy code base. It's actually 2.5 million lines of code. If it goes down for a second, like a state will be unable to do their taxes for the week. And for them, it's just simply not an option to sort of like look at a markdown spec and then say, hopefully this works. Even if they validate the code, it basically actually doesn't offload any of the time savings. Like you still basically have to go through the exact same process. But when you are able to upgrade the rigor by which the sort of specification and validation criteria are created, and you're able to actually vet and look through every dimension of, when we say it's going to migrate this table, what does that actually mean? What does correctness mean? Then people are able to spend much more upfront time reading through that basically high level specification and validation. And thus, if you actually say, we want an AI system to fully modernize this entire code base, the end result is just more trustworthy. And that time savings of being able to point out, no, we actually know exactly what validates that this is correct, and provide that to a large business. And also do it in a way such that they don't have to be sort of like perusing the internet for esoteric ways to manage agents, and instead are given like a clear interface that says you interact with an agent until you and the agent are both fully in agreement about what should be built. You understand exactly what good means, and then you can send it off and let it do work. This is something that we feel is, I mean, with missions, it's now here, but up until this point, it's sort of like missing from large enterprise conversations. And it just so happens that this thing's also pretty insane at making like 0-to-1 applications, working in greenfield code bases, doing all this other fun stuff. People are using it for research, for particle beam like management. There's all these crazy, I mean, there's a bunch of use cases that have been super interesting to hear people use, but
that's insane. Solving math problems probably, and next coming up.
There's been some, one of the first things we tested was trying to train basically a protein folding model that achieved like near state-of-the-art results on like the popular protein folding data sets that like DeepMind had. And so it generalizes to a number of different fields like math, science, engineering. I think that validation basically criteria, anything that is validatable falls under it.
More than ever, I think these, like you guys were saying, that the agents are actually going to need you as a human to define what that is. And it sounds like to me, like the validation parts are also the very important pieces of this whole thing too. And I think I think back to that example of somebody was taking Next.js as a project and they were trying to make it, like a Vite spin-off or something like that. Like all of those tests that they've developed over 10 years are super valuable. And if you can sort of work through your idea here and understand what you need to validate, or maybe the agent's kind of helping you with that process, that can help you define, what you need to lay out in your app.
Yeah. And I think one of the craziest parts about missions is that they leave your code base in a very meaningfully better state than when you started. And I think that this is something that a lot of people have been talking about with vibe coding, is like, what is like the tech debt that you incur from sort of saying, go and do this? A lot of people have this vision of like a house of cards where, you vibe code here, and then it all sort of topples at some point. But I think that what we've actually seen with missions is that because it is so driven to write tests and write validation, oftentimes it is much better at doing that than we are as humans. And so you end up with these code bases that are filled with end-to-end tests and unit tests and validation and lint rules and all these other things that the agents are actually building up so that it can succeed on the like N+1 task. And our sort of view is that why missions are valuable not only in these like large enterprise environments, but also for, as far as like solo developers, is because we think a good agent will sort of harness its own code base for itself.
Wow.
And basically that's what missions do.
For those who are wondering, this missions idea started 2 months ago. And 3 months ago, yeah. I guess we're in March now. And you pretty much worked nonstop once you started to uncover like the things of what was coming to be. And I feel like there's this compounding effect with your guys' company, which is really interesting, is that all the work that you've done prior is kind of leading up to this moment and is like continuing to go further, right? Like you have this harness, it's already really good and you just keep compounding it. And have you changed much of that code originally that you wrote for the harness, like for compaction or anything like that? Or like, are you rewriting and ripping everything back out? Or like, what's the thinking here? Or is it already good and you just leave it alone? Or like, I'm just curious from a software design perspective,
This guy changes he's 100% code churner. Like the code I feel like does not resemble anything like what it looked like even 4 weeks ago.
Wow. Wow.
I think, we're always looking to like optimize that portion of the code. Let it be the actual like harness that we're working on, or it could be like the performance or the memory usage. Like today, I've just ran a mission to like change all of our code so that we can like optimize our memory, and that basically led to 110 memory or 110 megabyte memory drop in just Droid itself, right? So that will sort of benefit us moving forward. But I think the idea here is just like there's portions of the code that remain relatively like static, right? A lot of our work in like prompting the model remains static, right? Because unless we learn something new from like our evals and stuff. But a lot of like the way that we think about the UX, which is deeply ingrained into the actual harness itself, also changes drastically, right? We now have decoupled this idea of like the mode that you're in, which is like the normal mode or spec mode, with the autonomy level that you're operating at, right? And so that was like a change that we made, I think, a few weeks ago that naturally required some changes to like the harness itself too.
I also noticed too in debugging, like that's a skill that I learned just working on the operating system. And then you learn, oh yeah, that's just how an environment works, or that's just the quirkiness of things. Do you feel like we'll lose that sense too, or those intuitions that we've built up over time making software? I mean, what do you guys think about that?
I think that probably like the way that this manifests is that there's an immediate term sort of sense that skill is going away because you have a bunch of people who are net new coming into the field who are just like, now I can just say like, please build me an app. I've found that I know infinitely more about software from watching Droid work than if I just was doing this myself. Like, I think it's like not even close. Like I see Droid do things. I know Bash so much better. I know how my computer works so much better. I know how Git works so much better because you're like watching the system sort of work And even with missions, like you start to get a sense of how systems should be architected in a way that I don't think a junior engineer would ever get exposed to. You're literally seeing a system think through systems in a more principled way than almost any human you'd ever talk to.
I think there's a group of younger people and other people who are being like displaced that feel bad because they're like, well, I had this important role at this company and no longer I'm there. To me, I feel like this is the time window. It's kind of small to say, well, they're still dealing with their bloat and figuring out how to get rid of people and whatever. I'm going to take this one feature that I use all the time or that I know is really popular. People are asking for it. I'm just going to go to the market and make it overnight and see how many people sign up.
We have pretty strong conviction that like the amount of people building software will continue to increase, right? The amount of software that we as a collective like species are creating is just going to exponentially grow, right? And that's because every single time you go to market with something, there's an additional need, right? There is something else that someone else needs to build. So I think there's a lot of like doom in this era, right? Because it seems so visceral. But there's also a lot of opportunity, I think.
Like never before in the history of like humanity have you been effectively like maybe like 600 keystrokes and an idea away from changing the entire world. Like you can publish on the internet immediately, right? Like you can post on Twitter immediately. You were 600 keystrokes waiting maybe 24 to 48 hours for a mission to execute and then hitting publish on Vercel away from actually changing the way that somebody lives their life. And that applies for everything, right? Like there's people who have all these problems that are unique to the geography they're in, to the culture they're in, to the groups or clubs or social environments that they're in. And like you can now just solve all of those problems like just by having the idea.
Here's what's got me. These people aren't trying to sell you more tokens, or they aren't trying to tell you just to prompt away and the AI will fix everything. They're seriously sitting down and arguing about which AI model has the right personality to check the other person's work, or even to check the other AI model's work. And you can tell that the engineers have been extremely deep on this type of thinking for many months. And so you're probably thinking, well, this is really cool theory and all, but like who's actually using this software? And these guys are actually shipping to real enterprise customers, and they're using this Droid harness every day. Personally, I've been able to go with millions of tokens, over like 14 million tokens just in one session. And this goes back to last year, and this has continued to improve over and over and over again. And I think what we're seeing right now is a massive shift in the way that the models are responding and how they can be orchestrated and working together to produce a result for you. And this missions product is an interesting peek into the future of AI coding, but maybe into the future of AI engineering or engineering in general. I'm looking forward to more conversation like this. And I go to these places because not a lot of people get access to these types of things. And if you want to keep hearing what's actually really happening just beyond the marketing hype, talking to real engineers, please subscribe because I'll be doing more of these. And if you want to build with me live, I'm streaming on the weekends. And you can also go ahead and put your name on the email list at startmy.ai. It's completely free. Just put your name on the list. So if we sit back, there's a lot that's kind of going on here, and I don't have a lot of answers to this. And I think it's really important that we sit down and code together live and just try to figure out what we need to do next. So make sure you stay subscribed, and I'll see you in the next stream.